like to tell you a little story that happened to me when a good friend of mine, Brad Bonner Jr., hired me to do a show with Dave Coulier, to open and do 30 minutes up front for Dave Coulier from Full House. You might remember him as Uncle Joey. He did all the cartoon voices, which, by the way, he still does in his act. Very funny guy. Dave was coming into town in the Jackson Rancheria in Northern California, and I was hired as his opening act. And I remember I was working as a poker tournament director at a card room in Sacramento at the time, in between gigs, because it didn't take a lot of time. I only did like once or twice a week. I would conduct tournaments, and that's all I did. And it was just a fun way to fill some time when I was home. And I remember going to the poker room that day at the Lucky Derby poker room, and an older gentleman stopped me in a parking lot and said, "Spirit Walker, I hear you're going to be at Jackson Rancheria this weekend." And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, who's that guy that's closing the show for you?" And I thought that was funny because, of course, Dave was the headliner and I was the opening act. But to them, to my friends and the ones that knew me in Sacramento, Dave was just simply closing the show for me. So the evening of the show, I showed up first in the green room, and I was back in the green room by myself when Dave walked in. And he walked up to me and extended his hand and shook my hand, and he said, "Dave Coulier," as he shook my hand, and I said, "Spirit Walker," and he said, "Nice to meet you." And I paused a moment and I said, "Dave, you know, we've worked together before." And he kind of looked at me puzzled and he said, "Really?" And I said, 2 years ago, you and I did the Tower Theater in Eugene, Oregon. I think it was Eugene. I'm pretty sure it was Eugene. I may be wrong, but I think it was Eugene, Oregon. I played a lot of gigs in Oregon, and they all kind of mixed together, but I think it was Eugene. I said, "We did the Tower Theater together." And he immediately apologized and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. That weekend was a blur to me. I had a lot of personal things going on." And he said, I don't remember a lot about that weekend. He said, "You know, that happens a lot on the road. You forget." And trust me, I know. You forget details. So anyway, he said, "Well, I promise I'll never forget you again." And I said, "Well, you better not forget me, Dave, because you're in my territory now. You're just closing the show for me." And I told him the story about the older man. And he said, "Okay, I'll remember that. I'll remember that. I'm closing the show for you. I'll try to do you a good job." And we laughed about it. We went on. We did the show. And it was a good show. We had a great crowd, very active, and just a fun time. So after the show, Brad Bonner came to me and he said, "Hey, I got him to open the dining room for us in the casino here. And it's just going to be us. It'll be me and you and Dave and an agent. Not Dave's agent, but another agent who was trying to get Dave lined up for another show." So it was just the four of us, and we were sitting in the casino restaurant, and Dave was regaling us with road stories of him and Bob Saget and John Stamos, and how they decided one time to go to Vegas and just go see a lot of these older famous comedians. And they went and saw Don Rickles, and they sat in a box, and Don Rickles saw the three of them from Full House sitting in the box, and he began to rag on them, you know, as Don Rickles' style is. He's the killer. He just ripped them apart, and they loved it. They thought it was like a badge of honor to be ripped apart by Don Rickles, because it meant you were somebody that he could make fun of and get laughs. And he told us all about that. And then he told us a story about going to see Bob Newhart. Bob Newhart was one of my favorite early comedians. Like I said, when I was a kid, my favorite comedians were all the now old comedians like Bob Newhart, uh, like Shelley Berman. Shelley Berman, you probably never even heard of Shelley Berman. He was a very funny, hilarious old comedian. And of course, Rodney Dangerfield and Don Rickles and, just even Bill Cosby. I had all his albums. Even Andy Griffith had a comedy album. What it was football. A great album. These were all comedians I grew up listening to and laughing and wanted to be like. And so he was talking about going to see Bob Newhart. And so they sat through the show, and then after the show, he went backstage to meet Bob Newhart, in his dressing room. And he walked in the dressing room, and this is how Dave told it. I walked in the dressing room, and Bob Newhart walked up to me and said, "Bob Newhart," and extended his hand and shook my hand. And I said, "Dave Coulier." And he said, "Nice to meet you, Dave." Dave said, then I looked at him and I said, "Bob, I was on an episode of Newhart." Bob Newhart looked at him and thought, And then he said, "I'm sorry, I just don't remember that." And Dave Coulier said, it was heartbreaking to me because I was on his show. And I looked at Dave and I said, "Dave, that kind of reminds me of something that happened to me earlier tonight in the green room." And he turned to me and he said, "Spirit Walker, I promise I will never forget you again. I promise." And that was just a fun time, a chuckle, a laugh that we had. But it was good to know that even somebody with the fame that Dave Coulier had gathered at that point in his career, still he and I were on the same level. Someone who had more fame than we didn't remember our name. A lot of people will tell you it's not what you know, it's who you know. I disagree. It's not who you know. It's who knows you. You can know everybody in the world, but if they don't remember you, it really doesn't matter. When it comes to show business, let me add. And when it comes to any kind of business, they have to remember you. Thankfully, my name is memorable, and yet Dave didn't remember. That's just life. Life is what you make it, not what somebody else makes for you. Hope you enjoyed this little chat.